I'll admit them. Welcome, everyone. We're so glad to see you. This is our first webinar for Accessing Farmland Together. And I'm going to put the link for that published guide into the chat. If you haven't had the chance to look at that guide, you can take a look at it there, and I'll probably share it one or two more times throughout our time together. This work is supported by funding from the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture, the Farm and Ranch Stress Assistance Network project, and then additional support was provided both by Land for Good and also Lutheran Services of Iowa. And the Farm and Ranch Stress Assistance Network was funded by the Farm Bill in 2018. And I just want to take a minute to let you know that I'm calling in from the land of the Abenaki and the Pennacook. Land is something that I consider to be honored and treasured, not exploited. And at Land for Good, we have an awareness of the real history of Indigenous peoples and nations in quite a long and ongoing era of colonialism. And so I take some time to honor and acknowledge those who continue to steward this land as they have done since time immemorial. If you are interested in learning more about the land on which you sit, I would suggest or invite you to explore Native Land Digital, which is an interactive map that reveals without colonial borders the different overlapping of historical and current Indigenous territories, languages, and treaties. So I've put that link in the chat, and if you're interested, I'd invite you to check it out. We have some interpreters with us today who will be interpreting from English and into Spanish. So just for a minute, I want to turn it over to one of them to explain this slide in Spanish, and then I'll explain again in English.
Muy buenos días, buenas tardes. Somos los intérpretes de mapa. Yo soy Brendan, estoy interpretando aquí con mi compañera Margarita. Vamos a estar interpretando de inglés para español. Entonces, tenemos la función de interpretación que ya está aprendida. Entonces, lo que va a tener que hacer es clicar en el globito aquí, que va a estar debajo a la derecha. O si estuviera en el celular, va a clicar en los tres puntitos que dice más. Después elegir interpretación de idiomas y después elegir español. Y cualquier pregunta que tenga, puede escribir en el chat. También hay la opción de silenciar el audio original. Muchas gracias.
Thanks. And then again in English, if you're interested in checking out our interpretation, at the bottom of your screen, down by where you can share, click on the chats or do Q&A, or just in that bottom toolbar, there's a little icon for interpretation. You can click on that. Select the language channel that you would like to listen in, either English or Spanish. And if you select Spanish, it should lower the volume on English. And you also have the option to mute the original English speaker. So if you're interested in that, go ahead and use that tool. And if you have any questions, pop them in the chat, and we'll be glad to try to walk you through it. So today, we're going to momentarily hear from Mike Gia and Kathy Roof, who are both with Land for Good. They're going to walk the group through the contents of the group land access decision tool and some of the ins and outs. And there will be time after their portion of the session for Q&A. And then after that, then we'll be hearing from some farmers who have some lived experience with group farmland access. And then again, Q&A after their portion. So that's our agenda for the day. And we're looking forward to being with you. And at that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike and Kathy.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is Kathy, and Rachel will be sliding through my presentation here. I'm going to talk a little bit first about some of the overarching concepts around accessing farmland together. And I want to say up front that this is not a how-to. I'm going to more focus on how farmers and service providers can think about group farmland access, what it means, whether it's right for them, how to make choices, and where to get more information. So with that, we'll go to the next slide. So just to be clear, group farming is also known as collaborative farming, cooperative farming, and so on. And those, they can mean a whole lot of things. Farmers can share equipment, inputs, marketing, labor, and so on. Farmers can also share land, which is not a new concept. So just to be clear here, we're talking about farmers sharing land, not those other ways of farming together. Next. So what we mean here in our tool is 2 or more farmers using a specific property for commercial farming. The land might be occupied by people who are farmers and also non-farmers together. And just to distinguish from other ways that farmers could be on land, let's say you are a landowner with 100 acres and you have separate rental agreements with 4 farmers who rent 25 acres. They don't have anything to do with each other. That would not be considered group farming. Next. So the defining features of group farmland access, they're accessing land together. There's a spirit of cooperation. There's purposeful interaction regarding the land's use and management among the farmers who are on that property, and some type of legal arrangement, which we will talk more about. Next. Why is there this increasing interest? As I said, it's not a new concept, but there certainly is new interest among younger and diverse kinds of farmers about how to get onto land together. We all know that land is expensive, it's hard to find. Historically disadvantaged groups find even more discrimination and barriers to getting onto land. And in addition, farming itself can be isolating. Farming on land together might reduce or at least spread the risk. There is the sense of community, and sharing land can, of course, lead to other kinds of sharing and learning together. Next. So if you're a service provider, you want to work with your farmers to make sure that they are clear about why they want to do this and what the reality is. So often the ideas and values, which are the drivers for groups of farmers who think they want to farm on land together, the values are very appealing. The reality, as we will get into a little bit here, is that, you know, it does involve money, control, decision-making, accountability, and a lot of things that are sort of, you know, reality isn't the same as the fantasy. So farmers should be asked, or thinking for yourselves, why are you interested in group land access? What does it mean to you? Who's in your group? What does your group hope to achieve as a group, and what might be some of the challenges? Again, this is a way to think about group farmland access. Next slide. There are 3 sets of relationships that are extremely critical in farming on land together. The interpersonal ones are all the social dynamics, communications, language, and values. And you can imagine that if there is disharmony or lack of understanding among the group members, that can be extremely complicated to manage and might not be successful. Whatever the arrangement is, there are legal implications. Some are more formal than others, often, but not always, written down. And then management is sometimes seen as the glue between the social and the legal. Equally important, it's about how the group is managed and how it governs itself. Next slide, please. So if you're a service provider, you will want to encourage the farmers who are expressing interest to think through some of these basics. If you are a farmer, similarly, think about them yourself with your own family and then with the others who you might be contemplating this method of land access with. What are the values and purposes that underlie your interest in this arrangement? Who's involved? Who are the individuals and entities? Farm businesses, other kinds of entities? What land are you talking about, and are there other assets? Buildings, businesses that might go with it. What are going to be the legal structures and arrangements? Mike is going to get into this in more detail, particularly around the rights, responsibilities, and commitments, and also how do people join and how do they exit? Extremely important when you're talking about this amount of either equity or commitment and risk. What are the documents that are needed? Are they in place? Are they sound? And what are the management arrangements that are going to hold this whole endeavor together? Next. Other basics. So the types of entities, the legal structure, are there sole proprietors that are trying to do this together? Do they have their own LLCs? Is it going to be a partnership? What types of tenure? Those of you who follow Land for Good know that we talk a lot about tenure, which means to hold. And there are basically two forks in that road. You can own or you cannot own. And if you don't own, then you will be a tenant. So ownership and tenancy are in those two different colors because we're going to track those in a couple of charts that will follow. So orange for ownership and teal for tenancy. If you as a group are going to be a tenant on land owned by others, then it's important to investigate the types of landlords and types of rental arrangements that are possible. And we won't go into great detail about these, but there are different kinds of leases, and there's also something called a license, which confers a different set of rights than an actual lease. Next slide, please. This, I understand, is hard to read, and you wouldn't be expected to. It is a schematic that shows up in our land access decision tool, which is another guide. Rachel, you might have a moment to put that link on the chat as well. It basically shows essentially the two kinds of tenure arrangements. On the left is ownership. On the right, as I mentioned, is no ownership. And in the middle is a path to future ownership of a particular property. And there are several methods listed in there, and then who might be involved in those kinds of arrangements. Again, just to place you in the sort of tenure landscape for group ownership. Okay, easy enough to share later in the conversation, the link. All right, next slide, Rachel. So the tool, which is on our website, goes through these actual steps, and I'm going to share those with you now. First step, again, if you're a landowner, a service provider, you're going to work with your farmers to help them make some of these decisions. The first one is group farmland access right for you as a farmer or right for them? And there is a worksheet that walks people through that. Then it's to talk about what actual kind of group are you? And we're going to get into that next. Then what kind of tenure arrangement do you want? Do you want to own or rent the land? And at this point in the decision making, you might entertain both options, or it might be clear to you that you're interested in one or the other. And then looking at the decision tree that's in the tool, which I will share shortly, which particular method might work for you? And then what are all the things you need to consider? So that's sort of a sequence of exploration on the farming together model. Farming land together. Next slide. All right, so we're going to pause here to talk about this guide. Again, this is a Land for Good's way of structuring this investigation so it doesn't get out of hand and that people have a solid grip on what the actual arrangements might be. So the first group we're going to look at is one farm, and that's a single farm business that has multiple owners and might own or rent a property. So it's one farm, it's Cultivamus Farm, it's one LLC, it has one website, one set of books, and it may have a group as employees. So one farm. The next one is an intentional group comprised of separate farm businesses that come together to commit to purchasing a property together or renting a property together. So they're not individuals on one farm, they are separate farms that want to get onto land together. The situational group is separate farm businesses that independently land on a property. And if you think about New Entry Sustainable Farming Project or Nuestras Raíces, Intervale might be another example of properties where somebody arrives to farm with others, but not in the way of an intentional group. They show up and they wind up on land together, and there are all kinds of benefits. You remember on an earlier slide, we talked about that they can share markets, equipment, knowledge, labor, and so on. But they're showing up to land on a piece of property that is typically managed or owned by someone else. And then the mixed group, this is sort of a hybrid that captures the other kinds of arrangements that we've heard about, where farmers are also sharing property with non-farmers. Could be an intentional community where there's several co-housing units. Could be a property where there are craft people, maybe some forestry people, and also some farmers as well. Another type of mixed group is sort of a mixed tenure relationship where a farmer could own land and then rent to other farmers. There was an example of that in our Cultivemos cohort. And so we thought that was a useful way to think about group farming as well. Next slide. So this is a decision tree, and I'm going to walk you through it. This is once you've decided if group farmland access is good, is appropriate for you to continue thinking about, that you know who your group is and what type of group you are, and then if you want to own or rent. So number 2 is the 4 kinds of groups: one farm, intentional, situational, and mixed. Thank you, little cursor. And then the next is what kind of tenure you want to own or rent. And you remember that orange is own and teal blue is rent. So let's just imagine you are an intentional group and you have decided that you want to rent land. Excellent. Rachel, is that you driving? That's great. So you follow the arrows and you can see that there are 2 possibilities. If you are an intentional group, separate businesses who want to rent land together, you might have separate leases, or you might form a real estate entity and rent from that entity. Thank you, Rachel. If you are a situational group, for example, a situational group would not likely come together and buy land together. You show up and would rent land together. Again, you might have separate leases, or you might have a master tenant, such as New Entry, and rent from them. So this is a way to visually sort of track the kinds of choices that you as a farmer or you as a service provider working with farmers might be contemplating. This chart shows up in our guide. Next slide, please. So this is, I'm going to go through this quickly because this is sort of a breakdown of those 10 methods. If you are one farm group, theoretically, you could purchase land as individuals under 2 kinds of joint ownership. It is not recommended by virtually all financial advisors. You could also form a real estate entity to purchase and hold the land and lease it to the farm business. Often, farm advisors will encourage farms to separate their real estate holdings from their business entity. So this is an example of where that makes sense. Or the farm business entity could rent from a landlord. Next slide. If you're an intentional group, that means you have separate businesses that are committed to working together. You could purchase land together as an entity and then lease portions to each of the separate businesses. Or if you are going to rent land, you could rent separately, or you could form an entity together. Often landlords do not like to have multiple tenants, so they could rent from the master tenant, which is your entity, and then you could sublease to your individual farm businesses. Now, this may seem complicated. It needs a little bit of thought and sort of revisiting, and I don't expect, you know, everybody to have digested this by the end of the webinar. It's just to say this is a way of thinking about how to consider group farmland access. Next slide, Rachel. Situational, again, this is where you show up with the intent to be farming on land with other people, and you would not likely be purchasing. So you would have a separate lease, or you would have a sublease from an organization that is a master lease and rents from a landowner. That's more common than you would think. I can think of several examples where that is the case. Often it's a farm-based nonprofit that is renting the land from a non-farming landowner or institution, conservation organization, that type of thing. Next slide. And then the mixed is where some farmers own the land and some of it rent to other farmers. I mentioned that already. And this one where farmers and non-farmers could own or rent the land together. And if they are purchasing land together, a best practice would be that they also form a real estate entity. Next slide. Now I'm going to turn it over to Mike, who's going to get into the weeds a little bit more on all of the financial, legal, and interpersonal considerations. And then we'll have time for some Q&A before we hear from our farmers.
Excuse me. Hi, I'm Mikey, and I'm the Vermont field agent for Land for Good. As Kathy said, over the next 20 minutes, I want to dive a little bit deeper into the some of the major considerations. You know, as Kathy said, as has been saying, is that it's really important for the group to make some decisions early on about what they're trying to do, why they're trying to do it, what are the benefits they're trying to get from it, before they start to really think about what the legal structure looks like. As Kathy keeps talking about, forming a legal real estate entity. That really could be a number of different structures, including the ones listed in the first bullet here. And we've seen most of these. I don't think I've ever seen an ASOP used, but we've seen most of these used here in the Northeast as legal structures. We often get when we get contacted by people who are thinking about farming together, they'll often start saying, well, we want to farm cooperatively. And, you know, I will press them on, do they really mean that they want to form a legal cooperative? And many times people don't know that a cooperative is a legal entity, or even just the concept of a legal entity is kind of foreign to them. And so they're not aware that perhaps a cooperative might be the tool that they want to use, but perhaps an LLC might do just as well or might be better, because there are both legal and tax implications for both. I think that going through the flow chart and the guide that we talked about kind of helps people kind of get towards being lawyer ready to start to be able to present to an attorney what they really want to try to accomplish and why, and some of the issues that they might have to think about in order to go forward. And they're, of course, can't go forward without good legal advice. They also need good tax advice because each of these entity structures have different tax implications, and how they're going to interact between how a landholding entity might interact with the farm entities, farm business entities, have to be considered. There's also going to be different, usually there's often going to be different structures for different purposes and also different legal documents. So for instance, you might have an LLC that is the real estate holding entity, and that in turn may have a ground lease with members, and a ground lease is a tool for leasing land for infrastructure. So they may be leasing the ground lease. The ground lease will be there for housing and barns and so forth. And then there might be separate agricultural leases. There's going to be an operating agreement with that LLC. So there's going to be multiple documents that people are going to have to prepare to work through. And in those agreements, it's important to think about the 5 Ds. What happens in the case of death, divorce, disaster, disagreement, and disability. We work a lot with this on intergenerational family farm transfers. And when you've got more parties that you bring in, that becomes even more important to think about how do people enter and exit in terms of, what happens if someone dies? What happens to their equity or their management position? What happens in the case of a divorce? Are both members of a couple even members at the beginning? And then, everybody likes to think it's all going to go on. We're all going to be happy and live forever and work forever. But you have to be thinking about long term, not just immediately when these arrangements are set up. And that gets to retirement and intergenerational transfers, and thinking about, is it going to be automatic that someone's position there could be transferred automatically to an heir? Or is there going to have to be some sort of board decision, or some sort of decision by the entire group? And those things need to be spelled out, early on, so that when these things come up, and they may come up sooner than people think, that it's really clear how things are transferred. Sometimes there will be buy-sell agreements, so that if people are building equity in land, there will be an agreement on how is the land going to be valued, and what time frame does the group have to buy someone out. And then just some basic thing, like whose names are on the document, who can sign for things, who can make decisions on behalf of the group alone, how are decisions made otherwise, what kinds of decisions can be made by individuals relative to their particular pieces of land that they're accessing versus things that are held through the group, through the leases, for instance. How do businesses interact? Who can sign leases? Who's can sign off on different things that may come up in terms of agreements, say with USDA. Next slide. And I think it's easy for people to take for granted that the legal agreements provide us a full level of security. And I think particularly with legal agreements, a lot of people's eyes will glaze over, and they'll think that if other people are working in their best interest, this must be secure for me. But really would encourage individuals to be getting their own legal counsel. In some cases, lawyers would be very clear that it's a conflict of interest for them to be providing advice for everyone that they might be providing. They have to be clear on whose behalf that they are working. Are they working for the group? What does that mean? But we do this with intergenerational farm transfers, this even with families, and a lot of people push back on this because, of course, nobody wants to spend a lot of money on attorneys. But sometimes bringing these other attorneys to the table can actually bring some creative minds there to address issues that might pertain not just to that one individual, but might actually make the agreement more secure for everybody. When you bring groups together, and particularly if people are farming separately on the same piece of land, you don't have full control over what your neighbor's doing as far as liability. And so you need to be thinking about how is everybody and the landholding entity or group protected in cases of liability. And that, the first tact on that isn't necessarily actually the business entity or real estate holding. It's making sure that everybody's safe. And that gets back to cooperatively working together on defining what do we mean by safety here on this premise. What's allowed, what's not allowed, and so forth. And the next layer before you start looking at legal entities to protect you is really about insurance and making sure everybody is properly insured, including if there's a group landholding entity that's carried insurance, and then who's in charge of making sure that the insurance is kept up, that it's a proper amount, to work with the insurance agent, and then collecting the money. How's that money going to be collected to pay for that policy? Who's going to make sure that all the individual entities or businesses that might be there have sufficient insurance, and named the landholding entity additional insured on the policy? And I think these things sometimes get overlooked until there's actually an insurance claim. Stewardship issues, it could be easily taken for granted amongst the group that everybody agrees about what good land stewardship looks like and what that means. And sometimes we see conflicts that come when people have differing opinions, and there's not a mechanism to discuss that or a set of stewardship standards that everybody agrees to, either in an operating agreement or in a lease or both. If people need to be certified organic, does that mean the entire property needs to be certified organic, or are there going to be specific parcels that are certified, but then is there sufficient buffer to the neighbors who are sharing the land? As Kathy mentioned, there may be instances where there's a master tenant and then subleases, but you can't take for granted that the landowner will allow for subleasing to begin with. And so that needs to be discussed early on as you're trying to locate and secure the land. And then also, if the group owns the land, there'll come an issue too. If in some cases somebody say, I'm gonna leave farming, or I'm gonna take a break from farming and I want to sublease this land for a period of time, is that allowed by the group? And if so, under what circumstances? What's the process? A lot of these things in putting group land tenure together ends up about thinking about process. So while there can be benefits to farming as a group, it also adds some layers of complication sometimes, and some time commitment to working through these things. Infrastructure, I think all these things we could really spend a bunch of time on separately and a lot more detail, but infrastructure is definitely one which and how permission is granted, who owns it, how it's paid for. All these things can get very complicated, and really people should, as best as possible, should be thinking about that up front when they're trying to put these together. Is how are we going? We know farms need infrastructure. There may be housing that needs to be built. How are we going to address? How are we going to address that? Including, can anybody just build anything that's legally allowed on that property, or is there going to be some aspect of the group that's going to participate in that? Conservation easements, of course, are a major tool here in the Northeast for making farmland affordable, and can interact with these approaches to help with affordability. But conservation easements also have their own restrictions and also have certain requirements that may not allow people to do exactly what they want to do. As an example, I was working with a farm that had conserved their farm about 12 years ago, and they were bringing on another party to farm on the property. And the original idea was it was conserved with a house and a cabin that could be made into a 4-season year-round home, and then another house lot that was where someone could eventually build a house. But all of those were included in the easement, non-subdividable. And so our original idea is that there would be a land holding entity. We were going to have an LLC, working with the attorney to form an LLC, and then the individuals would own the two houses, and then there would be a ground lease between the LLC and the homeowners. We sat down a long time with the land trust, and there was no way it was able to work within their legal framework. So we had to take an adjustment there, and the direction we were moving towards was that an LLC would be formed that would hold everything, and then there would be house leases that were built in between the LLC and the homeowners, and then also some arrangements within the operating agreement about who had equity and control as far as each of their respective houses. So they still had some semblance of control, even though technically they owned everything all together, including both those houses. And so that can get tricky when it comes to when you want to do maintenance or improvements on your home, and that's what we were trying to avoid. But because there was this existing conservation easement on it, we had to work around it in a different way, and couldn't go with the legal approach that we originally wanted. And so in setting up new conservation easements, it'll be really important work with the land trust and whoever's funding to think about these issues ahead of time, particularly if you want to divide equity in homes and infrastructure separate from co-owning of land. Next slide. So on to financing. So financing in these situations, it can be pretty straightforward, but for instance, if it's just one business that has multiple members that is, accessing one parcel of land together, that's really common. It's the financing for that's generally pretty straightforward. When you start to get into variations, particularly if you get into situations where you may have where you might have housing that's not subdivided, where the people are owning the buildings, the infrastructure, and not owning the land underneath the building, that's where things start to get a little bit trickier. But people have worked around these situations. But it's important to be thinking about this in the development of these situations and talking to lenders and seeing what fits within their rules and what works for them. And along with that, thinking about loan eligibility. So for instance, if you put a group together that has farmers that have been farming longer than 10 years and farmers who have been farming less than 10 years, you now have a group that doesn't qualify, is my understanding. The interpretation I've gotten from FSA, from Farm Service Agency at USDA, is that you can't qualify for a beginner farm loan anymore because it's a mixed group. And if you have non-farmers in the group, they may also not qualify for USDA FSA funding. And there may be other issues around liability. Do people all want to be on the same loan? Is there group agreement about debt and how to handle debt? And then particular what the collateral. So particularly when we get into these mixed situations where we're talking about infrastructure being held by individuals with a ground lease or some other connection to the land and it's not subdivided, then the question for the lender is what do we have for collateral in those cases? Can we, if we needed to, can we foreclose? What does that look like? Is there a right of first refusal of the group to buy that property back? That's one strategy people do. Does there need to be approval of the successor buyer by the group or by a board of the group, which limits the ability of the lender to go in, foreclose, and turn around and sell it? Is it limited to farmers? Is there limited equity, where in many cases people are trying to make this more affordable, so they're limiting the growth in equity in these buildings, and perhaps it may not there may not be enough equity there to secure the loan according to their standards. And these are not insurmountable, but they do make it more complicated and do limit in some cases which lenders will come to the table. But you can still, in some of these cases, depending on the structure, FSA, as I said, can still be involved. If it's a cooperative, the Cooperative Fund of New England, it was of New England, now it's of the Northeast, does loans for cooperatives. Some credit unions are a little bit more flexible, and some state agencies, but it really comes down to the devil's in the details. And so in the planning phases, it can be good to talk to the lenders about what you're thinking to make sure that this can work. In some cases, like agrarian commons, agrarian trust, they're relying a lot on philanthropy to bring in money to make these things happen. I don't know of any grants. We always get questions. People want to know, are there any grants to buy land? I don't know of any. But that people keep talking about that of late, of saying, oh, we want to support this kind of tenure model. Can we figure out somebody to provide grants for that? If anybody has any, then I would, be happy to hear about it. As far as eligibility for USDA and state programs, that's also needs to be a consideration, in terms of how are the arrangements made? Does it interfere at all with someone, say, getting an NRCS grant for a high tunnel? Or who has to sign off? If, with a lot of these NRCS programs, you need to be able to show that you have a lease at least as long as the management contract with NRCS is. And that may not be complicated at all, but it has to be taken into consideration, including who signs off on behalf of the landowner. Say NRCS, yes, we allow this practice to be put there and maintained. Property tax assessment, if particularly in situations where there may be a limited equity growth of the limited equity growth in infrastructure, that may not be recognized right off by the municipality, and they may be charging you the full assessed value on a property that the person couldn't actually, because of restrictions, turn around and actually recoup. And that, depending on the jurisdiction, that may not be insurmountable either, or it may not be consequential, but it is something that I think in some cases people are surprised by. And then land-based adequacy is something that I think often really gets overlooked, that people need to give attention to. So these groups coming in to farm together, do they really know how much land each individual needs? And not just now, but in the future. Do they have a good business plan that is also, or business history, where they know this is what I need to really generate and make my contribution to the purchase or holding of this land? And if everybody is maxed out on that land at the beginning, or finds that they're there, and that this piece of land that maybe they're not familiar with, maybe isn't as productive in certain spots as they hoped originally, or thought, or it's taking some time to figure out how to make it productive. It may be that there is a greater need for land that might be in that particular parcel. And so I think that gets taken for granted a lot, and people should really pay attention to that amongst the groups and amongst service providers, to say, do you all really know what you need? So that there isn't going to be a conflict when people need more land. And then, over time, I've worked with many startup farms over the last couple of decades, and I've seen many of them, resist the idea that they ever might get bigger. But just, you don't even need 10% inflation to know that, over time, businesses generally need to get bigger. That doesn't necessarily mean they need more land, because they might just get more efficient, more high tunnels, more winter growing, or something like that. But they may need more land, and that may not be a problem over time. But that it depends on the situation. The group may be in a position to buy more land down the road, or the individuals may be in a position to buy some of their own land off-site. Somebody might retire, somebody might fail, unfortunately, and then there'll be some land potentially available, and that certainly needs to be considered. Do you automatically bring in a new member, or do you give somebody else a chance to grow their business and grow their land base? On the other hand, there can be a lot of great complementary aspects to businesses. For instance, livestock farm and a vegetable farm, where the vegetable farm wants to have half their land in cover crop a year. Well, maybe the livestock farm can be grazing that cover crop during those years, and it would increase the amount of land that could be put into rotation. Next slide. I think it's easy to say, well, people buying the land together, it's automatically going to be affordable, and it's automatically going to be more affordable than an individual farming on their own. I've seen situations, though, where that just definitely isn't the case, and I think individuals and the groups should really be, clear-eyed about it and open to really looking at the numbers and saying, is this beneficial? Why is this beneficial? Or, is it because we're pooling capital that we can use towards closing costs? Is it because we're buying a larger piece of parcel of land, which generally has a lower per acre cost than a smaller parcel? What is really going to actually make the difference here that's going to make this extra complication really worthwhile? Or is bringing this cooperative land Opportunity Together is going to be more attractive to, say, philanthropy or a nonprofit or community members to help, you know, fund a project because they're excited about helping not just one farmer but multiple farmers. So there could be opportunities there, but you know, it really shouldn't be taken for granted. I just put the conservation easement funding back in because it is such a critical piece for the Northeast. But again, you know, are you actually going to be able to access those funds? To which in some case, you know, in Vermont here and most of the Northeast, it seems 40 to 60%. Reduces the property value by 40 to 60% when you first put an initial easement on it. So, you know, it'd be great to take advantage in many cases of that funding. But you need to know what is that going to mean for the organization? Are you going to be eligible? And then also long term, how it's going to definitely reduce the flexibility of the group to further maybe divide into smaller groups or bring in more people with more housing or more infrastructure. So it's once those easements are there, they're permanent, and so you have to take that into consideration and whether that taking that money is actually to your benefit or creates too many trade-offs. Right now, we're seeing, I think, two dramatically different discussions going on with equity in the land. On one hand, we're hearing people talk about group entity as an opportunity to potentially help people get land, wealth in land and build generational wealth in land. People who otherwise couldn't do that. And then on the other hand, there's people who are talking about it as a way of working towards decommodifying land and basically making it so there is no cash value there. And so these are two really distinct, different concepts. And I think this is where Kathy was saying the group really needs to decide what are their goals here. What are they really trying to accomplish? And I think if you look at the last three bullets here, these all interact with each other. So if you know, a lot of these models come out somewhere in the middle where they're recognizing, particularly if somebody's building a house or building infrastructure, they have money into that. They should have equity into that if they're bringing that to the table. But they want to reduce the speculative value, particularly on housing that grows there. But how does that interact with people's ability to fund retirement? How does that interact with people's ability to leave a legacy for their family or build that generational wealth? And, you know, we've seen examples of where people are, you know, who started these intentional communities, community land trusts 30, 40 years ago, you know, or into the 1970s, and they're getting there now, and they didn't make provisions alternatively for if they left the property and they were going to sell sell their equity or otherwise plan for retirement, and which is way unfortunate, for better or worse. A lot of farmers, that becomes a part of their retirement planning is cashing on their equity in their land. And if that's not there, there needs to be provisions, and this needs to be thought very early on in the process, very early in someone's life, to think about, well, how else am I going to retire if there isn't going to be the equity there? It's either none or limited. How would I afford to buy a house somewhere else if I leave? How do we plan for that so that somebody doesn't get stuck near the end of their lives without the ability to live a healthy life when they might not be able to farm, which sometimes is hard to get people to think about, particularly when they're young, that they might not farm until they die. And so there's this push and pull between those issues and affordability for the next generation. And so that needs to be thought through in these processes. Next slide. I'm just going to make a couple of quick points about this one here. Kathy kind of talked about some of this. Some of this has come up in earlier slides, but the communication and decision-making process and thinking about how you're going to do this is important. It's not always, while we talk about this sometimes as a way of reducing stress by spreading risk to people, this having to communicate with people can just add a lot of stress. Having to make decisions together can be stressful, but particularly when there isn't a great decision-making process or there isn't a great conflict resolution process. If it's taken for granted that there isn't going to be some conflicts that come up that may need to have a more definitive process about how to address the conflict. And sometimes people will divide things up very well, and they share tasks because there's some common tasks they make about maintaining shared driveways and roads, and paying the property taxes, taking care of the insurance, and everybody's fine with it. But then sometimes these burdens end up on individuals more so than others, and those people become resentful, and that can be problematic. And so thinking even about potentially compensating certain people within the group for taking on those additional tasks. And then I'll just say lastly, social activities that keep everybody together on not just on the business level, but actually appreciate being together is important. Next slide. So, there are some service providers out there that can help. Certainly anybody else who wants to offer additional ones. We're available here in New England. We tend not to work outside of New England too much, but reach out if you want. Equity Trust in Massachusetts is a great group that's been around a long time. We partner with them quite a bit. They have a lot of technical support and resources, particularly around ground leasing and some other aspects of these alternative models. The Cooperative Fund of the Northeast, besides being a lender, will also provide technical assistance to people who want to form cooperatives. Many of you, if not most of you, have probably heard of Agrarian Trust and their Agrarian Commons efforts. If you haven't, I encourage you to go look at what they're doing. I think the models are still evolving there, but they're definitely trying to work on this aspect of group tenure in a very concerted way. If you're looking at community land trusts, there's a number of community land trust organizations out there. And then we have panelists today that are in these models so you're going to hear from shortly. So, in some cases, those people can be, tapped for their knowledge. And, lawyers and accountants are definitely going to be a part of this, and finding the right lawyers and the right tax preparers. I think probably the lawyer becomes even more important, is a real critical aspect of this. Someone just put in the Cooperative Development Institute as another resource. Next slide. I'm going to leave this up here as we go towards questions. This is a Vital Communities is an organization based between the Connecticut River Valley of Vermont and New Hampshire, and they're going to start a webinar series. It's going to next week, as a matter of fact, it's going to dive into some more of these issues in more detail. So if you don't get enough today, you can sign up at their organization. Go to Vital Communities website, and Rachel's highlighting there down at the bottom. There's a number of good groups, including Vermont Law School, that's involved with putting this together. And with that, we can open to questions for Kathy and I before we go into the panelists. And I did see one or two earlier.
Thanks, Mike. There were a couple that came through in the chat. The first one was about legal structures and whether is the only way to incorporate as a benefit corporation in North Carolina through Delaware as a Delaware benefit corporation, not just the B Corp certification.
That is something I just can't possibly answer. Being here in New England, I don't know at all.
What would you recommend to start trying to track down the answer to that?
A local attorney that deals with benefit corporations.
Mm-hmm. And then a second question was, do LLCs have to get commercial real estate loans?
Well, at that point, if you're forming an LLC, you're likely going to be treated as a commercial commercial entity, particularly because you're doing this for commercial purposes. You're buying the purpose of buying the land and how it's funded is often how the lenders determine whether it's a commercial loan. It's not going to be a residential mortgage if you were just buying a house on 2 acres for one party, or maybe as a multi-family home with multiple parties, you might find a lender that will treat that as a home mortgage. But we're talking about buying property for a commercial use, so that puts you into a commercial lending situation. And that's why if your group can qualify for FSA and take advantage an FSA loan and take advantage of the FSA interest rates, particularly now with what's happening in interest rates, or a state entity, or I didn't say a community loan fund that might be willing to consider your model, then then you might get better interest rates than a bank with a commercial interest rate.
Someone else said, a big challenge can be finding the right attorney who has knowledge of the wide array of issues and tools you've presented here. And also, many existing attorneys who hold this knowledge seem to be retiring. Land for Good has done some attorney trainings to try to address this. Can you speak to this challenge and any possible future efforts to address this for New England?
Jamie, that's a really good question, and I wish that we had a better answer. Yes, we have done some trainings with attorneys and financial advisors together. We're working on our own sort of in-house list of attorneys. It's a little tricky because do you vet them, or who do you recommend, and so on. It's not a problem that's been solved. So if anybody knows of attorneys that are interested in thinking like this, please send those along, and we will absolutely do our best to share those names with people who want to go in this direction.
Thanks, Kathy. Are there other questions for Mark and Kathy? Oh, someone wants to know if Farm Aid has a list of attorneys.
I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know that they would have necessarily the attorneys with that level of expertise. Some, attorneys tend to be very specific. Some may be working with real estate, and others are just working on business entities. Some are working on bankruptcies. So it depends. But I don't know though.
And Legal Food Hub attorneys are, how do I put it, uneven in their knowledge and sort of currency in the kinds of things we're talking about. So it's a good place to start sometimes. But we, you have to really pick and choose. Pace University, that's an interesting idea. Vermont Law School also might.
Yep, and someone else suggested Legal Food Hub.
Yeah, I was just saying that that's uneven in terms of finding attorneys that know farming, and not to mention the kind of non-traditional methods we're exploring here.
As I mentioned, that Vermont Law School is involved in this series that Vital Communities is starting next week, and they're not providing direct legal assistance on it, but there are definitely people at Vermont Law that are thinking about this.
Sustainable Economies Law Center in Oakland. Thanks, Lynn.
I assume that must be Oakland, California.
Yeah, Selk is very progressive in these kinds of thinking. So talking to Neil, he might know other people in this area. Absolutely, that's a good idea. Another legal organization is Farm Commons in the Midwest. Rachel Armstrong is excellent. They don't provide direct service. FLAG, Farmers Legal Action Group, I think. Again, Midwest oriented, but yeah, I think it's an effort that we all need to make to bring more attorneys, make them more excited about this work. Thanks for all those suggestions.
Mike, do you know if any farmer wanting to purchase land would be subject to a commercial real estate loan? Whether or not they have an LLC?
So it comes down to what are they going to use the property for and how are they going to pay for it. So I have seen in some cases a private bank being willing to do a private home mortgage for an individual family, even though there was going to be commercial farming. And that was because there was I think in all the cases I've seen, it's all because the spouse has a substantial off-farm income sufficient that they know that regardless of the farm goes belly up or not, the mortgage is going to be paid for by that off-farm income. When you start telling them that you're going to pay for this, you're going to use the land commercially and you're going to pay for it through farm proceeds, that's when they typically will treat you as a commercial loan, and then that's where they want to see the business plan, and they'll unfortunately be putting it at a higher commercial loan interest rates, which is partially because they're looking at that as being a riskier loan.
Thanks, Mike. And if folks still have questions for Mike and Kathy, feel free to keep putting them in the chat. I want to make sure we have time to hear from our two panelists and to leave time also to ask them questions. And for each of you, if you would be willing, before answering some of the questions that I've just put in the chat, to just tell us a little bit about your farm and what you do there and how you got there. But then we'd also like to hear more specifically, what is your land tenure arrangement specifically and why did you choose that? What do you like about it? What are the challenges? And what help from service providers did you receive and how did that go? So after sort of giving us a brief introduction about yourself and your farm, those are the questions we'd love to have you start with, and then we'll start fielding questions from our audience. And if either one of you feels called to go first, you certainly could, or I could call on one of you and you could go. Jesse, I saw you unmuted.
I can start. I'm unmuted.
Great, thanks.
Thanks for having me. My name is Jesse Cahan, and my wife and I run Wild Carrot Farm in Brattleboro, Vermont, snowy Brattleboro. And we are a mostly horse-powered 45-acre farm. We mostly do vegetables at this point, although at times we also raise some chickens for meat and turkeys and pigs, and we keep right now we have 5 draft horses on the farm. So we mostly farm for a CSA, 150 member CSA or so, and a farm stand. So we are in a sort of unique situation here. We moved onto this land about 10 years ago. That had been occupied for 40-something years by a farm, and is still occupied by that same farm. And a few years back, they had built a second house on the land that was sort of destined for their daughter and family to kind of take over the farm. They were farming together with family, and that fell apart for various reasons. And so there was an extra house, and there was kind of this this space where Fairwinds Farm, who we share this land with, was wanting to scale back their operations, and at the same time make sure that they would that this land would continue to be farmed to its capacity, but they wanted to stay here for the rest of their lives, hopefully. And so they put out a kind of a call to farmers, and they did a lot of research, and we ended up connecting with them, and ended up buying the house that they had lived in for many years and taking on a long-term lease on this land. So our situation is kind of complicated. This land is owned by a land trust, community land trust, the Earthridge Community Land Trust, who owns the land itself. Both the other farm, Fairwinds, as well as now our farm, have a 89-year lease on that land. So we have a lease that encompasses our whole lifetime, but we don't own any of the dirt. We own all of the improvements above ground, and there are no specific development restrictions, but any sort of major development has to be okayed by the land trust. And so that's something that kind of happens on an as-needed basis and is a cooperative process. We have our arrangement with Fairwinds Farm includes sort of some separate areas. So we have cropland that just our farm uses. We have our own business, our own enterprises that are completely independent from them. But we also share the barns. We share horses. We share driveways. We recently put our woodlands into communal tenantship, so we have a joint lease on the woodland piece of our land, and that has worked surprisingly well for 10 years and hopefully for the rest of the time that we're here. When we got into this arrangement, we started it by renting the house from Fairwinds Farm, and we had I think a 1 to 3 year something arrangement where it was sort of a rent to own trial period where we kind of each of us had an easy way out if things didn't feel like they were working. And during that time, we had a lot of communication about kind of how things were working, tweaking what this might look like in a more permanent scenario. And then after, I think it took us 3 years before we kind of figured out all the legal aspects of it. We bought the house, we signed a long-term lease, and now we actually lease back most of the farm back to Fairwinds Farm for the rest of their life, but so that when they go away, when they leave on any terms, the whole farm reverts to us, minus a little piece around their house. And so that gave us some security that they weren't going to up and die one day, and all of a sudden we were going to have to kind of like look for new partners amidst whatever turmoil. It was a little more expensive to do it that way, because we have to lease the entirety of the farm's acreage from the land trust, and we pay a monthly fee for that. But it was, I think, well worth it in the security that provided. So there's kind of two distinct aspects of our arrangement that aren't necessarily linked, but for the purposes of this discussion, there's the multi-generational land sharing cooperation piece. We share this land with Fairwinds Farm. We cooperate on things like we talked about before. We share equipment, we share animals, we share some infrastructure, and then our land itself is leased from a land trust, and so we will never own this land, even if we own all the buildings above ground. So before this, we were landless farmers bouncing around from short-term lease. We were in 2 different partnerships before this, which we unwound successfully and amicably before we sort of settled on in this final iteration, hopefully final iteration. And we were looking for a long-term lease that would give us some security for thinking about kind of really setting roots for the long run. We had a business plan that didn't provide a lot of income. We worked off farm for a long time. We didn't have a lot of capital resources, and we were really kind of priced out of the market for buying land. So when this arrangement came up, we were able to kind of get a lot of the things we were looking for in a way that was affordable to us. It probably cost us a half to 2/3 of what it would cost to have bought this piece of land, including the house and the barns. Is that true? Yeah, with the houses, yeah. Our house is also in limited equity easement, so there's some restrictions that way. So it allowed us to sort of have a long-term piece of land that we could be on forever, treat it like it was our own, build a business and a family and all those things that people think about when they're looking for farmland. But it meant that we had a much smaller upfront fees, and that we don't build equity in the same way that most people might. And all the things that Mike was talking about in terms of unwinding this, retiring, building generational wealth, all of that is severely limited in our situation. But to us, it was a trade-off that we were happy to make, given that we got basically to do what we wanted to do during our lifetime. So some of the benefits, I mean, moving onto a piece of land where the people who have been farming this land for a long time is an incredible benefit that I having started farming on a land where we didn't have anybody who knew the land, and doing it here, just all the little idiosyncrasies of this is where in March the flood is going to come right through this piece, and you would never know it looking at it in August, when you're sinking your plow in the ground, yeah, soil health and just all those things. It's a huge benefit that we took advantage of and continue to. We took on minimal debt to make this work, which allowed us to farm kind of more the way that we wanted to, and not have to kind of scale up in some way that didn't feel right. And we're part of a land trust community of community landowners that we have independence from them. It's really, we treat it like our own land. We don't have to ask permission for things. It's like our own land, but we're connected with, I think, 6 other parcels of land and the folks that live there. Then we really own our land together, and we share ideas and vision, and I think there's a level of accountability in terms of how we manage our land. No one's ever come and said you really shouldn't be doing this, but there's a shared commitment to a type of stewardship, which in our case is not spelled out clearly, and it's always a thing that I think about. Where could that go wrong, or how could we do a better job of spelling that out? In terms of drawbacks, we share nearly everything with our neighbors: tools, space, pasture, animals, and in our case, I think the greatest downside of that is that we have like an overabundance of comic relief in our farm life, which we share with some a kooky older couple. But I think this could pose real challenges in another context, for obvious reasons. It takes a lot of time. We spent a lot of time in the beginning meeting together, communicating. There's a lot of process involved to make it work. And for sure, that's like a benefit in many ways as well. We've enjoyed that camaraderie and community, but it takes some time. And at this point, it doesn't take that much time at all. I wish we spent more time together, but there were a number of years where we spent a lot of time sitting down, meeting, and talking things out to make sure that we're all on the same page. We tried to, so I mean, it works really well with the people that were here. Like the people that are on this land work well together. I don't think that would necessarily be true with anybody. And when they go or we go, like we'll have to rewrite this book with somebody else, and that's always a risk. And we've done what we can by trying to keep the farm together as one parcel to mitigate that. But it's a concern I have sometimes. We have limited sovereignty in our land use decisions. this year, we, for a variety of reasons, decided to build a house, a new house. And even though we think of this land as our own and like we have full use of it, we don't, and we had to go through a process to get approval to build a house. It was fine. There's no easements the way that Mike was talking about in terms of what we were allowed to do per se, but we had to get consent from our landowners to make that work. And then banks really want nothing to do with us. As far as can tell, we've never been in a position to really be at the full mercy of the bank. But we bought our house originally directly from Fairwinds. We have a owner financing mortgage with them that has worked really well. But we did that in large part because the banks, despite saying otherwise, when it came down to it, just really didn't want to deal with it. And we financed our new house in similar ways, with cobbling together money from all over the place, everywhere except for the bank. So I think it's a really big cautionary note that, like, even our land trust has an MOU with our local bank that says, yes, they're willing to lend money. Here's how it would look. And when we called them and said, okay, we're ready to talk about a mortgage, they kind of laughed us out the door. And not because we didn't have the money necessarily, just because the structure was so unique. And again, I think to make this succeed, you just have to lay out boundaries that are really specific, and really just get into the nitty gritty. We thought out all the worst case scenarios and try to talk it out ahead of time when things were rosy before they ever happened. And I think that having had those conversations went a long way to preventing them from ever needing to play out. Some of the supports that we have gotten and used, we got lots of help with the transfer, especially from our farm partners at Fairwinds. I mean, they kind of held our hand through all of this. Land for Good has been a great resource. Our land trust, sort of as limited capacity as it may be, sometimes is full of people who really want to see creative answers to these complex problems, and we've used their expertise and ideas many times. We've had an open-minded lawyer look over our land lease and property sale documents, and kind of help us design the system that worked for us. But I also feel like we were pretty wary of the closed-mindedness of some of the legal advice that we got, where there were a lot of people warning us at the gate that this was like just too unusual. And I don't disagree that there are risks with all that, but I think if we had listened to that each time somebody told us that and walked away in fear, I think we wouldn't be farming today. And so, we really we tried to like believe anyway, while also taking the good advice of our lawyers. And finally, I think we used a broader values, mission-driven approach with our partners, especially to sort of guide the process all along. And so we have a pretty specific shared vision for what we want to do and why. And we have sought out principal people to be involved in this game together. And we've kind of trusted each other and tried to hold each other to those shared principles going forward, which is a really abstract hippie way of saying, like, it takes some real intention to make a complicated process like this work. And there are simpler ways to do it, but because we kind of believed strongly in doing things the way that we were doing, and that like we needed to kind of put each other's communal needs first, it has allowed us to keep working together, even when things were hard. So thanks for letting me tell our story a little bit.
Thank you so much, Jesse. Mike or Kathy, did you want to jump in here at all to ask or say anything, or would it be better to get Ben on and then take questions? Which would you prefer?
I think we should just maybe get Ben on, and I'll mention, unfortunately, our third presenter hasn't been able to make it, so we were hoping to have the third person here, but that hopefully will be with us Wednesday. But I think we should let Ben get going.
I agree.
Great. Thank you, Jesse, and thanks, Ben, for being here. If you wouldn't mind, sort of the same structure, tell us a little bit about yourself and your farm, and then those 4 questions. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Excuse me. Yeah, thanks for having me today. It's hard to talk about our land tenure without talking about our farm business, just because they're so tightly intertwined. So I'll kind of tell our farm story, and it kind of transitions to the land story. And so it's Bumberg Organic Farm. We're located in Windham, Maine, which is about 25 minutes outside of Portland, just west of Portland. We started our farm our first season was in 2015 on leased land in a few towns over. And for our farm business, it's owned by 2 different couples, so it's 4 people. And when we created our farm business, it's 4 people. Everyone has 25% ownership of the farm. We were friends. Myself and Jeff learned how to farm in Colorado together. My wife Melissa has different farming experience, and then Jeff's wife Abby had some farm adjacent experience. So we're all kind of had this dream of starting a farm, and when we started those conversations, it really was we have the same vision for what we wanted to do, what we wanted our farms to look like. We were trained by the same farmer, really. We modeled our entire farm after this farm in Colorado that we'd worked on for a few years. And so that initial coming together was just on a shared resource. We thought we could build this thing faster, we could do it better because we could do it together. And so that's sort of the ethos that we've kind of carried through the life of our business. We're now just wrapped our 8th season. So we started our farm in 2015. We joined there's going to be a lot of acronyms. I'm going to do my best to work those out. We joined MOFGA, the Maine Organic Farming Gardeners Association, which is our organic certifier here in Maine. They have a Journey Person program for beginning farmers. And through that, we took a farm beginnings course, which is a farmer-led business course, which helped us create a business plan for the ideal property that we someday were hoping to find. And kind of serendipitously at that same time, it was the winter of 2015-16, this property that we ended up purchasing, Maine Farmland Trust purchased this property from the family that had been on it for generations and put out a request for proposals to purchase the farm. So it was a competitive process, and the work we were doing through the farm beginnings course really dovetailed with applying or sending in a proposal to MFT for this property. The property it's 89 acres of kind of hilly pasture. It's got a big house, big hay barn, a carriage house, and a few outbuildings. It was previously kind of everything you can imagine. It was a dairy farm, it was a chicken farm, had beef cattle, there were some vegetables at some point. And we currently grow on 7 acres in production. The pasture space is hid by a neighbor dairy down the road. We serve 200-person CSA, about 30 restaurants in Portland, and we have a farm stand on the property. So when we purchased the property, we worked with Maine Farmland Trust. So they bought the property from the previous owners for over $600,000. They put an agricultural easement, and then they also put an added agricultural easement called an OPAV, which stands for option to purchase at agricultural value, which gives Maine Farmland Trust sort of first right to refusal. If we were to sell, they would either have to approve the buyer or they could purchase it from us at agricultural value. So that was just another layer of easement, which further lowered the price to when we ended up purchasing. It was under $300,000, so it was more than half decreased. And we also worked our lender, CEI, Coastal Enterprise Inc. out of Brunswick, Maine. They're a mission-driven lender, and they helped connect us with the Legal Food Hub and the SBDC, which is the Small Business Development Center in Portland. And the Legal Food Hub connected us with a lawyer for crafting our new LLC for purchasing our property. So we had our farm LLC, which was our farm business LLC. And then when we went to buy, this is our real estate holding LLC that we were advised to create from a liability standpoint. I don't know exactly why we were told to do that, but it seemed like a good idea at the time. And we worked with this lawyer, and we'd already gone through this process for our farm business of creating an operating agreement, really hashing out the 5Ds, all those fun conversations that you get to have. But it's for the land purchase, it's way more complicated just because there are all these restrictions on the land through the easement. We can't subdivide the land in any way. At the time, there was one home on the property. The goal was for eventually Jeff and Abby, we're always going to be on the house that existed, and then the goal was for Melissa and I to someday either build a house on the property or renovate one of the existing structures. We ended up carving out a 6-acre parcel on this property that we can then develop in the future for farm worker housing. This is how it's written into the easement. We ended up developing, it's an old carriage house that was just like 4 walls, a roof, and a slab. Turned that into our house after year 1. But the sort of the complicated nature of the cooperative ownership model, it's confusing and I think fraught if you view it in some ways. But to Jesse's point, we came into this partnership with like cooperation in mind and wanting to make our dream a reality, which is to farm. Like, we were young farmers. We'd been farming for just 1 season on our own when this opportunity came up. We had very limited resources. And so we set aside any sort of thoughts of future complications and everything that now is starting to bubble up. We're trying to figure out a bunch of things that we hadn't thought out totally at the time of purchase. Mike going over some of his slides, kind of like, oh yeah, we did that, we did not do that. But the way we structured and created our agreements for both the farm and the land holding LLC, really, we focused on preserving the integrity of the entity over the individual. So what I mean by that is that if it's really, really hard for me as an individual to take any equity out of either of these businesses. I'm compensated as a farmer, but there's no easy way for me to say I'm out and take all of the perceived equity that I have in this business with me. And that was really intentional when we worked with the lawyer from the Legal Food Hub. We as individuals, we didn't get any outside legal advice. Like, we didn't have our own individual lawyers advising us. So like, it probably would have been a good idea to have somebody in our individual corner so we could kind of hash out some of these things that we're now trying to figure out. But we met all together and we tried to figure out how to build an entity that would survive all disasters, all the 5Ds that Mike mentioned. And so what that looked like is trying to tie we have a whole system for unwinding. If somebody does want to leave, there's a series of events that happens. If I wanted to leave tomorrow, the existing owners could buy me out collectively. They could buy my share out collectively. If that wasn't the case, then an individual owner could try to buy me out. If that wasn't the case, then the existing remaining owners can then go try to find a separate buyer to buy me out. And if that's not an option, then I can then go try to find a buyer to buy my share. And if that's not an option, then there's no real final step for how to get my equity out. And so, and within that too, there's payment structure. So if I wanted to leave tomorrow and the remaining owners wanted to stay, there's a 5-year payment structure. So there's no way I can get out and drain a lot of resources from the remaining owners. And so that's just one unwinding aspect that kind of speaks to this idea of like, we're all working to maintain the integrity of this, the entity that owns the property, with the intention of wanting it to persist for a really long time. Like we want this entity and this land to be farmed forever. And it's still in process. We're still trying to figure out how to bring more people in and more people out of this group in kind of a seamless way, so that more looking like long-term and like succession planning, that we can figure out how to like keep new life into this business and organization. And I have a hard time talking about this linearly, so I'm sorry if I'm rambling all over the place, but there's separation between the farm and the land entity. They're two separate LLCs, but they're so tightly intertwined. When we talk to banks want to see the farm, they want to see the land, taxing, all the financials for both entities. It's like, sometimes I don't know that we're doing things correctly, because it feels like people are looking at both of our books and being like, oh yeah, you guys can definitely afford to take out this loan or something. But I think sometimes people get confused that there's a separation between the two, which can be hard to explain to folks. The ownership of the land LLC, so the farm is owned by, it's 25% ownership. That's static, that hasn't changed. We're just now starting to imagine what changing the ownership of the farm would look like bringing more people into the ownership structure. For the land LLC, we've tied all of our ownership to the equity that we've put into the property. So when this property was purchased, like I mentioned, Jeff and Abby are in the big house. Melissa and I weren't on the property yet. So Jeff and Abby brought more money for a down payment relative to the house. We broke the property into 3 kind of buckets. It was the house, it was the farm and the farm structures, and then we kept the carriage house separately, just because Melissa and I were planning to build that into our home. And so at purchase, we kind of each brought a certain amount of money, capital, to the project based on where our ownership was going to lie. So Jeff and Abby brought more because they were buying the house. We equally brought the same amount for the farm, and then Melissa and I brought a separate amount for the carriage house, and that was all tied to the initial assessment of the value of buildings and structures, and how we broke the mortgage down is slightly complicated, but that's static and that remains. So now where we're at today, Melissa and I, 3 years ago, renovated the carriage house. So we had to, kind of to Jesse's point, like we tried to go get money from a bank outside to take a barn and turn it into a home on the property. And there was just nobody was interested. And still to this day, that's one of the largest challenges, is getting traditional financial institutions to give us loans for things that are not directly related to our farm business. Our business is able to secure loans, and we've been able to grow. And working through CEI, or initial lender, we work with CEI and we work with Gorham, a local bank, Gorham Savings Bank, and we've balanced between the two of those. CEI is a little bit more flexible and willing to take on projects that traditional financial institutions are a little bit scared of, but Gorham has better interest rates, and if we can do some sort of business loan that fits within the standard view of what a business loan looks like, then we can make that work. But when it comes to making improvements on our homes, or potentially adding any more worker housing to the property, it's that we're in that problem. We're trying to figure that out right now. My wife and I are trying to figure out how to make our house a little bit bigger. We have 2 kids and 2 bedrooms in our home, and the financing of that is proving to be one of the largest challenges that I don't know if we're going to be able to overcome it, just given how expensive things are. So that's just kind of how the equity initially worked, and then year to year the interest in the land LLC ownership interest gets adjusted based on how much equity went in over the year, and equity gets put into the property through capital improvements to our homes. It's principal paid to the mortgage, or principal of the mortgage that individuals paid, and we make those adjustments, and then we adjust the relative percentages of ownership of the business. And the idea behind that is to try to create some sort of mechanism for valuing our ownership in the business. And it's tied directly to how much we put in. So again, this comes to maintaining the integrity of the farm. Like, my ownership in this business is never going to exceed the dollar amount that I put in capital. There's no appreciation of that capital over time, or valuing that in any sort of growth over any sort of time span. It's really just hard numbers on, I would theoretically could take out what I put in. And again, that's just to protect the entity. And our view is that this is never going to be like a money making, like generational wealth developing part of it. But I mean, very similar to what Jesse was saying, it's like this by entering this agreement, this has allowed us to create and operate the business that we've dreamed of. We've been able to support our families off this land. We're still growing and trying to figure out how to bring more people into this project and support more families off the land. So that's the trade-off. You know, I think if we had talked to lawyers that were individually kind of giving us advice at the beginning of this, there would have been a little bit more pushback on this protecting the collective. But I'm really glad that we did that, just because it really is the ethos of our group, is to farm this land, to steward this land, to feed our communities. And if somebody doesn't want to participate in that at some point, that should not impede the ability of others who want to continue that mission. So that's just a big piece of kind of how we think about our business structure here. But it's a pass-through LLC entity that owns it. So my family, the Fishers, the farm, all pay rent to the landholding LLC. And then that rent is directly tied to mortgage payment, taxes, insurance, and that gets adjusted annually for changes in taxes and insurance costs. The mortgage payment's pretty static. So that's kind of the summary of the structure. Again, the succession planning, more on the farm side, we're starting to think about how to exchange ownership interest in the farm business. And I think it might involve evolving to a C Corp to have actual shares that can be exchanged for dollar amounts as we bring new ownership into the farm business. And we're just starting to explore those possibilities as we have long-term employees, that the next step is some level of ownership in the farm. And so, I mean, what's worked for us is just that initial, I don't think we would have been able to buy this property if we weren't doing it together. And, you know, the farm came first, so we were already doing it together. It wasn't like we came together to buy the property, but we've always, during that process, it was never even a conversation that an individual or family would be the one buying the property. It was always, we're doing this together. The farm comes first. Like, the farm is sort of the core of what we're doing. And yeah, just as land is getting more expensive, it's crazy looking back and thinking about the numbers of this. It's a 89-acre property. We're less than 10 miles from Portland for $600,000. It's like, that just doesn't even exist. And this was 6 years ago that we purchased the farm. So it's, I can only imagine those challenges just accelerating for young farmers. Also just separate, what's worked for us too is like the separating it from the farm. So creating that separate LLC has allowed us to manage both separately in an interesting way. And I think as we start to explore more, bringing new owners into the farm business, keeping the land separate on an ownership basis is going to be really important, just because we live here and we don't intend for any new owners to live here, and trying to figure out that balance will be interesting in the years to come. Also with the LLC operating agreement, we spent a lot of time creating it, and we vaguely review it on an annual basis, but there's still, there's flexibility in that arrangement to change anything we want to change. That if over time something doesn't seem to be working, we can come together, and if we can agree to change something, we can do that. The LLC operating agreement is literally just whatever we say we want it to be. It's a strong foundation that if something were to go wrong, we can fall back on it. But in a position of things going really well, we can review it and make changes that better suit sort of our vision from where we are now. What challenges have been, again, it's just that the biggest challenge is that personal equity and leveraging capital on a personal level, especially as we're thinking about our needs, our family needs, and what we need for our homes. That's a challenge that I don't have a solution for, and it'll be interesting. We've got to figure that out. So fortunately, I think I'm hopeful that some of the bank arm that we work with, we've worked with them for so long, and we've done enough business with them with business loans and other things that we might be able to balance some sort of construction loan potentially with the equity that we have in the property, but that would have to go through the LLC, so it's complicated. And just the biggest thing too, I just want to say is just the I know it was Mike's last slide, and I don't think it can be understated. It's just like the interpersonal I don't know, demands. It's funny, when we rented land in Buxton, the town over, for the first 2 years, we all lived together. So we all lived in a house. We hung out all the time, like cooking dinners, everything. We don't hang out anymore that much. We work together, we spend a lot of time together, but like that, our families have grown, we all have kids now, but it's the demands that it puts on your relationships can be challenging at times. And especially when you're living on a property, the proximity is real. And having a really strong foundation for communication, I think, is absolutely critical. And we've been able to rely on Abby's full-time off-farm job is in HR, and she's trained in crucial conversations, which is has served us so well as a tool for having these really hard conversations that you have to have as business owners when there's a lot of money and resources on the line. So yeah, that's my story. Sorry, I was a little rambling. It's really hard to tell this in a straight line. So thank you.
Thanks, Ben. I think you covered all the topics and covered them well. Want to open it up for questions. And again, apologies. We were hoping to have a third presenter who hasn't been able to make it. But is there any questions out there?
For either of the panelists, or for Mike, or for Kathy?
Yeah. I'll ask Ben a clarifying question. So when you're in your structure, when you improve that building into a house, so then how exactly was that recognized in terms of your equity in the property?
Yeah, so we for that project, we like couldn't get loans from any businesses, and we were able to get loans from multiple family members to make that possible. And so that was our personal money as the form of a loan, was basically $100,000 that our capital accounts that we use from an equity management standpoint, just for me and Melissa, both went up by $50,000. So that changed immediately overnight, changed the ownership percentages of the land LLC pretty drastically, just because for Jeff and Abby, even though they had a down payment for the house, their accounts hadn't really increased because we're paying a mortgage, and the principal of that mortgage is changing we're paying off small amounts of that principal in the first few years. Over time, that's going to even out pretty drastically, but initially, that's created a big jump because the share of the mortgage that this structure had before it was improved is like $50 a month or something. It was just like the value of the structure was really, really low until we improved it. So yeah, it's sort of the mechanisms at any snapshot time, I don't think really portray sort of like the longer term intention of, or like what it will eventually be, but that's kind of how that mechanism works, if that makes sense.
Yeah, just on a few clarifying things for people who are not familiar with the capital accounts are used as ways of tracking people's equities within an LLC, and it's something that often gets missed. People don't necessarily track exactly what we were just talking about, and I really encourage people when they set these up to work with an accountant and make sure that they're annually looking at those kinds of changes. But for maybe to clarify a little bit more was if in your case it was basically because you put 100,000 in, your capital account went up by 100,000 and it didn't change based on how the value of the property changed. That house isn't necessarily 100,000 plus whatever the structure's value was before.
No, exactly, and that's where it's tied directly to the dollars that we're putting into the property. There's no assumption of, I did all the work myself. Like the actual value of this home is way higher than that $100,000, but we're not capturing that in any meaningful way. Again, with the idea that any equity that would be coming out isn't valued in some appreciating way. It's really just a 1-for-1. Like if I were to leave tomorrow, we would theoretically be able to sell, or what we could ask of the remaining partners would be just what we put in our capital accounts.
And to be clear too, what you were saying with the partners is when you pay a amortized mortgage early on in the mortgage, your proportion of interest, the principal is much higher, favored higher to the interest. And so because over time, what you're saying is that as that shifts towards principal, that's where their equity will catch up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, correct. And we have like a threshold of dollar value that we can actually record for the capital accounts. I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but Jeff and Abby replaced all their windows in their house last year, and that was like a big enough expense, kind of like a capital improvement on the house that we included that. But like when you paint your house, like the inside, that doesn't count. So there's a dollar number that every year everyone saves receipts, and if we think that the project warrants a change, then we include that in the capital accounts.
And a similar line of questioning with Jesse, particularly since you just built the house and Earthbridge has an equity restriction. Can you describe how those two things interact, the cost of you building a house and then what Earthbridge says you're allowed to resell it for under their formula?
Well, in our case, the limited equity clause is a kind of an optional piece that people put on by choice. So the original farmhouse that we used to live in, that we bought from Fairwinds, that house was given to Fairwinds for kind of work done many, many years ago by the previous farmers. They chose to put an 80% limited equity clause in their deed. We bought the house. As I understand it, we wouldn't have had to continue that, but we did because it seemed like the right thing to do. So that house we can only sell for 80% of its appraised value. Our new house does not have, well, it doesn't even have a deed yet. I mean, we're still sort of in the frontier of this process, but we at this point don't plan on putting an 80% limited equity clause on the new house. I think that's a conversation for like down the road when we have more of our feet underneath us. So, but again, we don't own the land, and so the kind of value piece, the house is worth what it is. It's worth less than it would be if it had land associated with it, obviously, and it's probably worth even less because it's got land that somebody else has some say over. So selling it would be complicated, but aside from the fact that we would need permission to sell it, it's pretty straightforward for the new house, I think.
Looks like Kathy wants to ask the question.
Not a question so much as just more observation. Somebody wrote, about hearing about the nitty gritty of these real situations. And I just want to point out that in the guide you remember there are 4 different group styles and there are 10 methods. The guide does give real world examples of each of those 10 methods. So you might look at the guide, you can follow to see those stories. And also the person who was not able to come today was an example of a tenant on property that is managed by a nonprofit. So that's quite a different approach than Ben and Jesse. And just to reiterate, there are all kinds of variations on the structure that we provide in that guide. And you can see that when it hits reality, there's a lot to work out. So Ben and Jesse, I want to thank you personally for sharing your stories and for letting people see what it looks like, when we really try to actualize these things. Rachel has put the links for the Accessing Farmland Together guide and also the land access decision tool. Rachel, I'll hand it back to you. You can ask people about the evaluation and blah, blah, blah.
Thanks, Kathy and Mike and Jesse and Ben and everyone for coming. If you do end up having follow-up questions, feel free to reach